Hello there. So we're going to cover our next narrated PowerPoint is on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, which is chapter 12 in your theme for booklets. So first and foremost, I'd like you just to think about demand and supply in a bit more detail. Try and remember the things that you've learned about that. Write a definition of demand and supply, draw a demand and supply curve, remembering to draw in and label the axes, the relevant axes, and also put together a couple of definitions, one on aggregate demand and how that's made up and what aggregate supply is too. So that's a little bit of a revisionary task for you to consider, and then we'll move on and start looking at how the AD and AS model can be used to help understand and show your understanding of macroeconomic policies and the impact on firms and individuals. So take a look at what we're going to learn about in this topic then. First things first, we're going to look at changes in aggregate demand, known for as a shortening of AD. We're also going to take a look at aggregate supply and the changes in aggregate supply, or AS for short. We'll also look at full capacity output and how that has an effect on both of those things, and also some of the macroeconomic indicators that might be affected by full capacity, and also the changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply on inflation and unemployment. So expanding that a wee bit further to think about, if we have those significant changes in either AD or AS, how is that going to affect some of the macroeconomic objectives that a government might be trying to achieve, like controlling inflation and also try to get as close to full employment as possible. Excuse me. And then can look at the multiplier effect and how that has implications for the amount of money that's going to be going around, the circular flow of income, and how that can then have an effect on both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And then also try to look a little bit wider at what some of the implications of the AS-AD model have for the economy as a whole. So that's basically the structure of it. There's going to be quite a few examples of graphs, which hopefully you'll be reasonably familiar with, but we'll break those down and go through them step by step, and hopefully you'll be able to use those to demonstrate your understanding of how this whole system works. Okay. Excuse me. So in this instance, then, let's go back to fairly basic stuff and look at the aggregate demand curve. Downward sloping, as we know, and in this instance, what we're trying to do is demonstrate the way in which we might construct these diagrams to give a clear idea that you understand what's going on in this case. So here we have the price level, so that's the average price of all goods and services in the economy, and there we are, labelled vertical axis as price level, and in this case we've got price level P. And when we look at the aggregate demand curve, with it being downward sloping at price level P, we're going to get real national output at Y, if we assume that to be the case. So let's go back one, sorry. So real national output is basically the output of the economy, but taking into account inflation. Remember, we have real at the start of any real income, real national output. It means that we've taken into account inflation in those calculations. So it's really a much truer reflection in this case of if national output has increased, or real national output has increased, it's due to the fact that we've had improvements in the economy, and we've got some economic growth, not just based on an increase in price or a change in price. So let's look at changes in aggregate demand then. So remember, we need to be able to use and demonstrate that you understand the different components of aggregate demand. In this case, obviously, I'd like you to just have a think about what those components are, and see if you can list what they are. And there is a bit of a clue. There is a formula that you can use, which I'm sure we've covered together before. So any changes in aggregate demand, then let's look in the first instance at movements along the AD curve. If we get any movement along the AD curve, that's been caused by a change in the price level. Okay, so movements along the AD curve caused by a change in the price level. no other reason. If we get a shift in the AD curve, and that means that either it goes out to the right or the left, that's due to changes in any components of AD. And remember those components, if you got your formula correct, were consumption, investment, government spending, and then the difference between exports and imports, or net trade, which gives you the overall AD for an economy. And the view is that in the UK, as an example, around about 60% of all AD is down to consumption. So clearly, influencing consumption is going to have a significant effect on AD. Let's take a look at that explained or expressed graphically. In this instance, we're showing movements along the AD curve. And in this case, as you can see in the first case, where we were initially, was at price level P. We had real national output at Y. But if we have a rise in the price level, so if the price level goes up to P1, then there will be a fall in real national output to Y1 because demand will have fallen due to the price going up. If we have a price fall, we will fall from P to P2, then in that instance, because there is greater demand at that price level, then Y2 would be the new level of real national output. So there is a clear link between those two things. Let's look at changes in aggregate demand then, in a slightly different way, when we're looking at a shift in aggregate demand rather than a movement along the aggregate demand curve caused by the price level changing. Excuse me. So in this instance then, we've got a situation where any increase in any of the components of AD will lead to a shift from AD, which is our original demand curve, outwards to AD1. Okay, so we have an increase in any of consumption, investment, government spending, and an improvement in net trade, then AD will move from AD to AD1. If we have a situation where there's a decrease in any of those components, then AD will shift from AD, the original aggregate demand curve, to AD2. Okay, so that's demonstrating again very clearly that if we're talking about a shift in the aggregate demand curve, that's down to a change in any of the components of AD, okay, but not the price level. So let's take a look at short-run aggregate supply then. So we've talked about demand. Let's take a look at supply now. Again, same principle. If we're drawing these things into our diagrams, we need to make sure we label the diagrams, make sure we label the axes, and also in this case, label the curve. In this case, we're showing a short-run aggregate supply curve. Now let's take a look at some of the reasons why we would have changes or movement along the SRAS curve. Again, same principle, price level against real national output. Again, we've got in the short term or short run aggregate supply, if the price level that we can sell as a producer increases, then clearly then more people are likely to want to supply, and as a result of that, as the price level goes up, so would SRAS. So in this instance, a rise in the price level will lead to an expansion in short-run aggregate supply. However, if we had a fall in the price level, that would lead to a contraction in short-run aggregate supply, because in this instance, less people, less producers would be willing to supply at that level due to the fall in the price level. So those are things that will cause movements along the SRAS curve. And again, it's down to price level. So whenever there's a movement along either the SRAS curve or the AD curve, that is caused by changes in the price level. Clearly, in this instance as well, if there are changes in aggregate demand, that is going to lead to movements along the SRAS curve. If AD increases, then firms will choose to hire more labour and make more resources work harder. in order to boost supply. Excuse me, got a bit of a frog in the throat. So that would be the reason for that. And if you think about it, if you've got more people wanting to buy your products, then and capacity, you need to increase capacity, then clearly that would be a reason why you would then choose to buy more resources, including labour, and that would lead to an overall increase in supply capacity as well. Okay, so let's take a look at a shift in the SRAS curve. So same sort of principle again, where in this case, if we have a shift, a decrease in costs of production. So more often than not, a shift rather than a movement along the SRAS curve is going to be caused by a change in cost of production. So in this instance, if we have a decrease in cost of production, that means that producers can produce stuff for less. We're going to get a shift to the right from SRAS to SRAS1, and that effectively means that we have greater capacity in the market. Okay, if we have an increase in the cost of production, however, that's going to cause a shift from our original SRAS curve to SRAS2. So there is a clear link between the way in which those both supply and demand curves might move, dependent on changes in the economy. Let's take a look then at the long-run aggregate supply curve. So when we're talking about differentiating between short-run and long-run aggregate supply curve, that's very much the classical economist view, which we're going to look at, and then we're going to compare that to the Keynesian view, and then discuss when is best to use each one. I think the general view is that the Keynesian view allows you to explain in a bit more detail and evaluate slightly better, but there are instances when you can actually demonstrate the difference between short run and long run and use the sort of classical economist view. So the view is that in this case, if we've got the long run aggregate supply curve at full capacity, this is basically the way we would draw that in. So it's basically a vertical line. So long run aggregate supply, and this is very much the classical view, is basically a vertical line. So Y in this case represents full capacity output. So if we the Y here represents exactly like I've just described, full capacity output, and that's when the economy is producing goods and services where there is full employment. So all resources are being used in the most efficient way. So we've got particularly one factor of production where we can't change that, we can't increase that, and that is the view that at full capacity output, that's where in the long run we would always be producing. So let's take a look at some things that might affect long run aggregate supply then. Now, one of the things that we can use, and we talked about factors of production, and in this case, if we look at factor mobility, that refers to the ease with which you can use factors of production and use them in a different way. So obviously, if there's less factor mobility, then that's clearly going to have an effect. So let's take a look at things that will affect the long run aggregate supply then, and that can shift when there is a change in quantity and or quality of factors of production. So even in the scenario where we've got this full capacity, obviously if we can improve the full capacity by improving the quantity or the qualities of factors of production, then we can actually shift LRAS out to the right. Okay, so examples of things that can have an effect, or factors of production that can have an effect, clearly land. If we've got additional land available, or we've got new primary raw materials we can use from the land, then clearly the productive capacity of the economy will improve. And as a result of that, LRAS will increase and there will be a shift. Labour is the next one. Clearly, if we actually had an increase in the size of the labour force, you'd expect that output would also increase in the long run. Another way in which you could look at it is if we improve the quality of the labour through education and training, that's going to mean that efficiency and productivity should be improved. So effectively our cost of production should fall, certainly in terms of the unit cost anyway, and that should allow longer and aggregate supply to increase. In addition to that, if we think about other ways in which labour might be increased or improved, if we've got improved occupational and geographical mobility, then that clearly gives firms more flexibility in production and hopefully a more flexible and a larger labour pool to choose from. So there are some reasons for and factors that affect LRAS. There are some more, as we'll see in a minute. And let's take a look at the next one then, capital and technical progress through technology and productivity. So if we can improve the quantity and quality of capital, that's going to improve the level of productivity, and that again is going to boost longer and aggregate supply. More often than not, it's likely to be technology that improves that process. Maybe it's research and development, maybe it's improving the quality of the products that we're producing, innovating, coming up with new ways of satisfying consumer needs. And also that is likely to improve productive efficiency too. So a number of reasons why capital and technical progress should actually improve productivity. Enterprise, the next one, entrepreneurship. Obviously incentives for businesses to set up or to invest in and developing new products and services. That's clearly going to lead to, again, a boost in longer and aggregate supply. As we get more new businesses setting up, then clearly that's going to mean that more people, more producers are likely to be wanting to work in different markets, and that's going to improve overall aggregate supply. And the last one is clearly government intervention. Now, obviously in the free market, we don't necessarily believe in government intervention, but we can also see that in a mixed economy like the UK is, we've got a situation where the government might use regulatory frameworks to improve competition levels in different markets, and that clearly is going to have an effect on longer and aggregate supply. And if we can improve that and generate greater competition, that is going to drive efficiency gains, and also that should mean that if firms are striving to maximize their profits, then we should get to better allocation of resources, and that clearly should then increase longer and aggregate supply. Okay, let's take a look at shifts of the LRAS curve then. So we've shown that in some instances we get, in the short run, we can get changes due to the price level. In this instance, what we're doing is looking at how we might get a shift in the LRAS curve. And effectively, if we had an increase in the quantity or quality of factors of production, that's going to cause a shift from our current point of LRAS outwards to the right to LRAS 1. If we had a decrease in the quantities or quality of factors of production, and that can be caused by a number of things, as we'll see, then we'd have a shift the other way to the left, where effectively we would move from LRAS to LRAS 2. So a bit of a test for you. Have a go at filling in this table. Okay, each of the examples given in the table that's showing will have an impact on LRAS. What do you think the impact's going to be? Will it increase or decrease LRAS? Okay, so if we're talking about an increase in LRAS, that's where the overall productive capacity of the economy is going to improve. We have a decrease that's been caused by the overall productive capacity shrinking for some reason. Okay, so if you want to have a go at those questions, give that some thought. We'll stop the presentation for a bit and fill in those that table, and then we can take a look at what the responses would be. Okay, so the first one then, the government introduces new immigration laws to limit the ability of migrant workers to seek employment in the UK. That would actually cause a decrease in LRAS because the overall level of labour would fall. we're talking about the government introducing tax breaks for companies that invest a proportion of their profits in research and development. Well, that research and development in the long run should actually increase the long run aggregate supply. How about if there's an extra 2 billion made available to education and training? That again should increase LRAS in the long run. That should improve aggregate supply. Raising the retirement age to 70. Oh my gosh. Got to work till then that clearly would effectively increase the long run aggregate supply, because in that case that would mean that there would be more workers available, and so that should improve long run aggregate supply. How about pressure groups successfully blocking the development of fracking? Well, that in that situation, that would probably reduce or decrease long run aggregate supply, because in that instance, that is limiting the amount of resources that, in this case, fracking is to do with the oil and gas industry, and that would obviously then potentially increase the costs of production for organisations, and so decrease long run aggregate supply. And then if the government invested 1 billion in widening broadband coverage, again, technological change and improvements is likely to improve the overall level of long run aggregate supply. Okay. So with a lot of these questions, if you just go through the process of thinking, right, what effect would that have? Would it increase or decrease? You can normally just spell that out yourselves. Okay, let's take a look. So we've talked about the difference between the short run and long run aggregate supply curve. But when we talk about the Keynesian AS curve, you'll see it's slightly different in that there's no difference. There's no delineation, if you like, between long run and short run aggregate supply. So we've said that the classical view is very much that the economy will always produce the maximum that its factor resources will allow. And that is a view that the classical economists have held for a significant amount of time. And as a result of that, the reason why classical economists believe that is that you've always got efficiency, and you will function most efficiently over the long run. And so any economy should be producing on the outer boundary of its production possibility curve. And obviously, if that's the case, if you're working at full capacity, that should mean that your long run aggregate supply curve is vertical, because you're marking the maximum limit of production that the resources that you've got available can produce. Okay, so that's very much the classical view. However, John Maynard Keynes came up with a number of economic theories, but this was probably the most important one and most influential one. He believed that the economy could be in equilibrium below full employment, and as a result of that, he actually came up with a slightly different plan. Now, he did an awful lot of study and was heavily involved in trying to solve the issues in the US of the Great Depression during the 1930s. And he concluded that basically the LRAS curve was an upward sloping one, not a vertical one. It did have a vertical section, as you'll see, but like the LRAS curve, but at times the economy could settle at a level of output that was below full employment. Okay, so and this is how this was demonstrated. Okay, so this is the Keynesian view. Okay. So effectively, what we're saying here is that the long run aggregate supply curve does have an area where it's relatively flat, and we'll explain why in a minute. So in this area here, so we've got not a great deal of change for a number of, certainly in terms of the price, although we might have an effect on the level of output, as you can see. And it does get to a point where it does become a vertical line, and again we'll demonstrate that, and you can see that that's at the full employment level. So there is some links, clearly a link between the classical and the Keynesian view, but we'll try and break this down and try and explain it in a bit more detail as we go. So if we assume then that our curve, our Keynesian AS diagram, holds good, so we've got price at P, and then we've got the LRAS becoming vertical at full employment, there is an argument that if we are performing, if the economy is performing at A, okay, you can see at A we've got unused capacity. So firms could increase output without increasing their costs in this instance, and there's reasons for that. One could argue that if you've got spare capacity, you're not going to need to increase wages. You're not necessarily going to need to buy new machinery. You've got effectively the opportunity to produce more at the same cost, as we'll see. If we actually then move up the curve to B, you can see that in this instance there is still some limited spare capacity, and the economy is getting somewhere near full employment. Okay, and as a result of that, firms will find it more difficult to attract scarce resources, and so prices, there will be a bit of a price level increase. So that could be down to an increase in wages, or also the fact that because resources are becoming more scarce, then it costs you more to buy those resources, whatever they may be. If we get to the point of C, okay, so we can see that's the point of full capacity. You can see that in this instance, if we look at our FE level, so that's full employment, obviously our factors of production, if we got full employment, then we can't find any more people to produce goods and services, then we're at full capacity. We're working at our production possibility diagram right at the frontier of that. Okay, in that situation, if we've got that position, full employment, and all resources are being used. Okay, now let's just take that on a slightly further and try and explain what that means for both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So if we got a shift, if we're talking about a shift, we've got the opportunity to shift the Keynesian LRAS curve in exactly the same way as we shown in the classical view, and again that's down to changes in either quantity or quality of the factors of production. So if that were the case, what we would find is that we'd still have that same shaped curve, but effectively when we're talking about getting towards full capacity, then effectively the overall ability to produce at full capacity, where we've improved the quantity and quality of factors of production, will shift the LRAS curve out to the right, okay, in the same way. So we've got a new level of full employment 1, okay, where effectively we've improved the quality or the quantity of factors of production. So we've shifted the overall productive capacity outwards to the right. If we have a shift the other way, where, and again we talked about the change, so that if the quality or quantity of factors of production fall for whatever reason, and there can be a number of reasons for that, then we're going to have a shift in the LRAS curve to LRAS2. So the overall full employment real national output at FE2 is significantly less as a result. Okay, so which LRAS curve should you use? And that very much depends, okay? Depends on all sorts of scenarios, okay? But it's important to understand the difference between short run and long run aggregate supply curves, because that's used very often to just check and test your understanding of economic concepts, okay? So you need to understand the difference between the two. Certainly in the long run, having an understanding of both models will help, because it helps you to explain and evaluate more fully the impact of economic policy. Now, the argument is, generally speaking, that the Keynesian version is considered to be more realistic, and in terms of being able to explain and demonstrate your understanding, sometimes, more often than not, it's quite easy, easier, and allows you to expand your explanation more if you're using the Keynesian model. However, both classical and Keynesian models have some issues in terms of the assumptions that lie behind their theory. But I would suggest that you should know both, but I think the one that probably is easier to demonstrate and be able to explain more is using the Keynesian view. Okay. As we said, these are models rather than perfect predictors of how an economy might behave in any situation. Let's take a look at this question, a few questions for you to consider. First, multiple choice question: which of the following developments is most likely to cause a shift in the long run aggregate supply curve from LRAS 1 to LRAS 2? So we've got 4 options: growth in export markets, improvements in the banking system, an improvement in consumer confidence, and a sustained increase in government spending on welfare benefits. Okay, so let's just think about what we're being asked to do. We're suggesting that we've got LRAS moving from LRAS 1 to LRAS 2. So that must mean there is an increase in the overall productive capacity of the economy. So let's take a look and see, would growth in export markets cause that? Well, what would that have an effect on? Growth in export markets would have an effect on aggregate demand, wouldn't it? So that's probably not going to be the one. How about an improvement in consumer confidence? Again, that won't affect aggregate supply as such. It will affect aggregate demand, won't it? And then a sustained increase in government spending on welfare benefits. Well, if that is the case, if the government is spending more on welfare benefits, that's going to mean probably that less people will be willing to work. So in that situation, that would shift the LRAS curve, the supply curve, from LRAS 1 to over here. So that would actually reduce the long run aggregate supply. If we're talking about improvements in the banking system that will increase the funds available for investment, well, clearly, if we've got more investment available to businesses, then that is likely to mean that they are going to have more investment, and that should then improve the overall aggregate supply. So in this case, the answer would be B. Let's take a look at the second example then. So in this case, we've got a shift from LRAS 1 to LRAS 2. So there's a reduction in the overall long run aggregate supply. Would that be affected by income tax rates? No, it wouldn't, would it? Because effectively, income tax rates would affect aggregate demand. The growth of labour productivity. Well, if we had a growth of labour productivity, that would shift from LRAS 1 out to here. Okay, so outwards to the right. And if we had a fall in interest rates, that is effectively going to cause more people to invest and borrow money, and that clearly would then, if anything, increase long run aggregate supply. So in this instance, if we had a fall in the capital stock, that's the amount of capital being invested, then in that case, that clearly would have a negative effect on LRAS, and so the answer in this case would be A. Okay, let's take a look at long-run equilibrium then, in terms of how we include that and show that in the Keynesian scenario. Okay, so basically we've got our AD curve drawn in, and we've got our Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so we can see at full employment, the LRAS curve starts to become vertical. Okay, so in this instance, then again, remembering that you need to draw in and label all of your axes. I always get into the habit of doing that. This is the scenario that we've got here then. Okay, so in this instance, let's just recap that Keynes believed that the economy could settle in equilibrium below full employment level of output. Okay, and again, that's probably a more realistic view than working at full capacity and at full employment consistently in the long run. So in this situation then, the difference would be that if we have aggregate demand at this point here, okay, where aggregate demand crosses or intersects with the aggregate supply curve, the long run aggregate supply curve, we can see that at this point, rather than being at full employment, the point at which aggregate demand is satisfied by supply is producing at level Y. So there is some spare capacity within the economy as a result, if aggregate demand was at this level. If that were the case, one could argue that this would actually cause some unemployment, okay, because there's actually more capacity available, but actually if there's not enough demand, then the fact is that some businesses might choose to lay off workers, and then as a result of that, that's going to mean that there will be some unemployment where there isn't sufficient demand to satisfy the supply that's available. If we look at equilibrium real national output then, okay, that's the point at which planned AD is equal to planned AS. So that's the point at which an economy would be at equilibrium. Now the view is, the classical view would be that there should be economic policies that improve long-run aggregate supply. So that's very much the classical view. And that's not to say that aggregate demand isn't important, clearly it is, but if AD were to increase with no attention being given to the quality and factors of production, then the only thing that's going to increase is inflation, and that's potentially going to damage economic growth. And if you think about that, if we're just thinking about, right, we're going to increase aggregate supply, we're going to need to improve aggregate supply consistently, but if we get to the point where we haven't, or we're ignoring that, then an aggregate demand does increase, then all that's going to do is create inflationary pressures, and we'll try and demonstrate that in a graph in a minute. Okay, so let's take this as an example then. So if we're in a situation where I'm going to move myself down there, it's going to make it slightly easier for you to see, I think. So we're at point 1. So our equilibrium position here is at P1, okay, at price level 1, we would produce at national output Y, okay, because that's where the market would be in equilibrium. So if at that point we actually have an increase in consumption, what would happen? Well, if you have an increase in consumption, that's going to affect AD, that's going to cause AD to shift to the right. And at that point, that would mean that we would have AD moving from AD to AD1. That's going to cause an expansion along the LRAS curve as well. The price level would increase to P1, okay, and also as we get closer to full employment and the resources become more scarce, we would also have an increase in the real national output, where we would move from Y, which was the original equilibrium point, to Y1. So we'd have an increase in the overall capacity, but we've still got some room to increase because we've still got some spare capacity between Y1 and FE, okay, and then at full employment. So you can see that where we're not working at full capacity, or we're not producing at full capacity because there's not sufficient aggregate demand, there is room to move the equilibrium point and also not have a massive increase in price level. If we actually take a look at the next level, then let's assume that AD continues to increase. That's essentially going to mean that we're going to get increases in aggregate demand, but no increases at this stage in terms of longer and aggregate supply. At some point, we're going to reach full employment, the full employment level. So if we actually get to this point here where AD continues to increase, excuse me, and then we get to the full employment level where we've got all of our resources being used to full capacity, then any increase in aggregate demand over and above AD2 is basically just going to cause inflation. We can't produce anymore. The only thing that's going to do, and if you think about moving that AD curve even further, that's going to significantly increase the price level, isn't it? Simply because you're going to have, we can't produce anymore in this moment. And as a result, if more people want to buy, then all that's going to do is increase the price. If we take the opposite position though, okay, so if we're in a position where we've got AD that's significantly depressed, so aggregate demand is very low, it might be down to the fact that we've got some some form of recessionary pressures going on in the economy, maybe. That could be caused by any number of things, as we know. But let's assume that we have aggregate demand that's depressed down to A3, at AD3. So if, let's say, we had a slight improvement, so we maybe are coming out of recession, maybe we've managed to find new demand from somewhere, then in this situation, AD4 would move to the right, so shift to the right. So that essentially means that there is an increase in aggregate demand. However, in this case, you can see that the price level hasn't changed at all. Now, the reason for that is that there is a significant amount of spare capacity here, and at this point, wouldn't have to employ more workers. You've still got machine capacity, and in this instance, that spare capacity could be used up, and any increases in aggregate demand could be absorbed without an increase in the price level. So in that case, you could argue that there wouldn't really be a great deal of point at this level of aggregate demand in increasing the level of long run aggregate supply, because although it would be good in the long run maybe to be able to do that, effectively it's not going to change the equilibrium level of employment at this stage, because there's simply not enough demand in the economy. Okay, so let's take a look then at how that might, we can see that we've hopefully got a reasonable understanding now of aggregate demand and how that affects and causes changes in long run aggregate supply too. Okay, but let's take a look at where, if we're in the long run, how the Keynesian long run aggregate supply curve might shift. Okay, so let's take a look at our equilibrium position. So this is at a point where we're at reasonably close to full capacity, because you can see our full employment capacity in terms of long run aggregate supplies in this area here. So our market's in equilibrium at AD, and that gives price level P, and Y is our real national output at that level. If we had an increase in capital efficiency, though, that would cause long run aggregate supply to increase. That's going to cause LRS to shift to the right. Okay, so in this instance, if that were to be the case, this is how you would show this on your diagram. So fundamentally, you'd have the same LRS curve, but effectively it's shifted out to the right. Okay, so we've improved and increased the overall productive capacity of our economy, and as a result, we've increased LRAS to LRAS1. If that were the case, okay, that would then cause an increase in the aggregate demand curve, or could potentially cause an increase in the aggregate demand curve. The price level would decrease in that situation, as you can see. So in that case, we've got this increase in aggregate demand. We would now be at a new level of production at Y1, and also our price levels would fall. Okay, so if you think about that, we've increased our productive capacity, and that's improved our efficiency, and as a result of that, we are able to produce and supply at a higher rate, and that clearly means that where prices fall as well, aggregate demand will also increase. Okay, now obviously if that were the case, that means that our factor resources have increased, and the scarcity of those factor resources has been reduced, and that means that effectively we've increased the overall level of capacity. Now in this instance, where our aggregate demand has increased because of the fall in price of production, there is also, in the longer run, there is also an increase in the overall productive capacity of the economy, and it's now moved out to FE1. So effectively, where our vertical line starts to operate at LRS1, it's at a higher level, and effectively our overall maximum productive capacity has also increased, which indicates an increase in economic growth. Okay, so I've talked for quite a while now. I'm going to give you a chance to just take a look at an example. It's got a nice case study that if you click on that link, you can go and take a look at the oil industry and the sorts of factors that are going to affect demand and supply in the short and long run in the oil industry. Excuse me. So I'm going to leave you to take a look at that, and then we'll come back and talk shortly. Okay, so let's take a look at the multiplier next. Oh, excuse me. So the multiplier effect is basically when you get an initial injection into the economy or circular flow of income, and that causes a larger final increase in the level of national income or output. I think I'm going to stop here because I think I'm going to have a coughing fit. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll reconvene, and we'll start at this point in the next presentation. Okay, so if you'll excuse me for a minute, I'm just going to stop, and I'll be back. Normal service will be resumed as quickly as possible. Okay, thank you.